Hello. Thank you very much for meeting me today. My name is McCrorie. I'll be talking to you about the challenges with human rights and safety in international aviation. Every day, millions of passengers cross the borders by air, trusting that their rights will be protected from them, from the country that they're going to or the country that they're from. Um, but what happens when when these rights vanish at 30,000 feet in the air, or what happens when this airline um, doesn't have the liability of you when you are traveling between airlines in other countries? The purpose of this is to really introduce the tension between human rights and the safety during travel. Let's dive in more and show you the problems that are being talked about. And with our key points, global air and travel enables economic growth but exposes passengers with inconsistent legal protections. There is a critical gap between human rights and the jurisdictions that have weak oversight. Current aviation laws fail to protect passengers, harmonizing policies with other countries and their ethical frameworks that are needed. The Chicago Convention standardized aviation safety but left human rights to sovereign states. For example, U.S. citizen traveling through another country may face detainment without due processing. There are situations where a citizen was detained in another country due to a disputed tweet, and not understanding the local laws. This is where people can get in big trouble traveling internationally, not knowing the clarity in what they're doing and how it may act on up to others. The background of these issues, there's decentralized enforcement with domestic local laws, passenger rights upon landing. The ICAO sets standards but lacks authority in other countries in human rights. For example, in 2020, a Malaysian passenger was barred from a London flight due to an unflagged risk assessment with no recourse in hand. This really airlines often disclaim any type of liability once the passenger is off the plane, leaving the passenger at the mercy of the local laws at the destination which they find themselves in. And this can be a lot of trouble. That passenger can find themselves in much more trouble than they can find themselves to the destination at which they want to be going to. There are different viewpoints that can argue these items. We have the national sovereignty argument that must tailor security to the threats. The human rights arguments like the El Masri Macedonia, with the abuse that was stemmed from. And then there are biblical perspectives that we really need to instill with Micah 6:8, calling for justice and mercy, the urging for advocacy for the vulnerable in Proverbs 31. While sovereignty protects nations, it can enable abuse, especially with the rate of search and seizures, targeting minorities or targeting people who may not have the same faith as others. This is really where Mark 12:31, of loving your neighbor and just ensuring the fair treatment for all passengers as one is traveling through international country that they haven't been familiarized with. There's some legal analysis to be aware of with the Chicago Convention. There's sovereignty over airspace, but it's silent on rights, right? The Montreal Convention covers injury and death, but doesn't cover detainment or discrimination. These treaties assume states will self-regulate, but authoritarian regimes rarely do. Precedent courts have ruled against abuse, but the enforcement is just unaccountable. So let's show you some data with these issues traveling in other countries. The Middle East has high detainment rates, which correlate with weak oversight. The data illustrates reports that are often found and suppressed that aren't reported enough. And, let's kind of talk about this momentarily. We see Middle East, Europe, and North America. And let's look at the logistics of North America, how it is separated from Europe and the Middle East by 2 oceans. The Europe is connected to the Middle East with neighboring countries. There is active wartime happening in the Middle East. There's so much more traveling and different industries, different cultures of personnel that are coming through, different faiths. And this would spike the detainment, spike the discrimination, spike the search and seizures, especially in the Middle East. You look at the neighbor, right? It's lower than the Middle East. Yet North America is still very low. Yes, you may face these discriminations and detainments and searches. About 1/3 to 2/3 less than most other places that you'll go. The case study with El Masri and Macedonia versus Macedonia. The incident was German citizen Khalid El Masri was detained in Macedonia and tortured in CIA, an extraordinary rendition program. European Court ruled human rights found Macedonia violated Article 3 prohibiting of torture of the European Convention on Human Rights. Flight logs showed complicity of airlines in rendition of flights. The Al Masri case exposed how aviation networks can enable human rights abuse. The court fined Macedonia 60,000 euros, but no airline was penalized. Should the airlines be penalized in this type of situation where detainees face torture in other states? I think it's the safest way that airlines don't claim any liability for this situation, because airlines don't have any type of government say of which rules they are operating in. It's probably safest for the airline. Yet there really needs to be an international protection for anybody in this type of status, right? If they're not a resident in certain places at the time, they fall under a category which protects themselves, and it should be kind of due process on their own country's accountability. There are responsibilities that stakeholders need to take account for. You have the airlines, you have the governments, you have the ICAO, you have passengers. And with the airliners, they really need to disclose the risk and refuse complicity in rendition. Governments need to enforce the treaties and sanction abusive states. The ICAO expand mandate to include human rights in audits. Passengers really need to be more transparent and report these violations at which they hold. In 2023, Delta updated contracts to ban participation in rendition flights after shareholder pressure. 78% of passengers in 2024 said they pay more for airlines with human rights. With future trends and risk, there's biometric screening, there's climate migration, and AI security. Imagine you're arriving at an airport where AI system denies you for boarding because of your risk score is too high with no explanation or appeal. This isn't sci-fi. This is happening today. And climate change will force millions to flee by air. There's going to be climate changes where people can't go by ground because of the snow or because of the water, and they need to travel by air. And will they be treated as a passenger or suspects? And we really need to advocate for AI transparency with security, and making sure that these risk assessments are targeting not just Middle Eastern names, but proper personnel who may be at a higher risk than just the typical person traveling to try to make a new life for themselves. There are a lot of legal imperatives here. With the Chicago Convention, they cover safety, but their human rights are not covered. With the Montreal Convention, it's partially covering the safety, but not covering the human rights. The EU air passenger rights cover safety, and it's limited under human rights. The proposed reforms cover safety. So here are some recommendations for that. Qantas already alerts passengers to death penalties for drug offenses in transit countries. That is so scary to hear that would be possible for anybody traveling, even if they had an unknown drug issue and they could be faced to the death penalty. Treaty reforms, amendments to add human rights and clauses to bilateral air agreements, and amendments could audit nations with high complaint volumes. Imagine you're a flight attendant watching a passenger being forcibly deported. They're sobbing and begging for help, but you've never been trained on how to take care of this. This isn't a hypothetical situation. Most cabin crew have zero guidance or training of how to detain personnel or release personnel with proper protocols. There are trainings to how to turn aviation workers from bystanders into rights defenders. And if there's crew training, mandatory human rights modules could really help handling detainees and deportees. With cultural competency, the bias mitigation and security checks and passenger interactions. Industry accountability, certifications for human rights, and compliant airlines. Airlines of global actors can emulate Paul's example by ensuring passengers know their rights. Here's the challenge. Would Jesus endorse profiling? The golden rule suggests otherwise. You want to treat others how you want to be treated. In Proverbs 1:8-9, the advocacy for the voiceless. And in Acts 22, Paul's assertion of Roman citizenship mirrors due process and demands. Paul, arrested in Jerusalem, invoked his Roman citizenship to avoid scourging. Passengers today lack equivalent protections in many jurisdictions. A call to action between the aviation professionals must speak up for passengers as Paul did. Ethical imperatives as good Samaritans for stranded passengers. There is a call to action that needs to happen. Here what we can do today as travelers, we really should be looking for good airline scoring for traveling, and airline rights. For professionals, advocate for human rights clauses in airline contracts. And with citizens, support the Fly Rights Act requiring detainment of reporting. We will be the generation that grounds human rights being abused in aviation. As we board the next flight, let's ask whose rights are left on the tarmac. Justice in aviation isn't optional, it's turbulent. We must navigate together. Aviation must evolve to protect its rights without compromising safety. Call for legal reforms and ethical vigilance to protect human rights and to ensure safety while traveling. These are the references that I utilized for the subject. I thank you all for your time, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your year.